Okay, hello everybody. Good evening from GRASP, the University of Tokyo. Welcome to this GPPN webinar on the global impact of the war in Ukraine. The third installment of our series on thinking public policy. 8 years ago, when Russia illegally annexed the Crimea, I still remember speaking on a panel at the LKY school. Tragically, I'm now once again on a panel discussing the absolutely shocking, appalling, full-blown Russian war on Ukraine. There's no more pretending this time with the little green men. And the names of towns like Bucha are now painfully seared into our collective consciousness. The war is a cause for outrage and shock. It is also a point for reflection for those of us in the 7 public policy schools that make up the GPPN network. I'm grateful to our speakers today for taking time out of their extremely busy schedules to share some thoughts with us on this seminar. I'm sure you've all looked through the advertisement, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the achievements of our distinguished panelists. So I don't think I want to spend time revisiting those achievements again. So I think it's more important perhaps to dive straight into the panel discussion. We've asked each speaker to speak for about 8 minutes each. So without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, Professor Casaroche from FGV. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. It's very early in the morning here, and I know that for Tom, we share the same problem today. It's very early, but I hope we can have a great discussion about the war. So the title of my presentation was Reflections on the New World Order. So the idea, the point of my presentation is not to talk specifically about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now, but rather to think about what the future may bring in terms of how the international order will be reorganized after the war in Ukraine, or even during the war in Ukraine, to be more specific. So I want to share with you a few thoughts about this old new world order. And the whole point of my talk here is to try to make a case for a future international order, which will very much look like the past, right? We have elements from history that might help us understand what might happen in the future in terms of how the world will organize. So there has been a lot of speculation around the shape that this new world order will take. And in my opinion, the first thing that we have to take into consideration is that we must forget the last 30 years of international relations in order to understand what is before us for the future. So the last 30 years, or in other words, the unipolar world, has been a very exceptional period in international relations. So, okay, thank you so much for that. So the unipolar order has definitely ended. And why do I think it has ended in the first place? So first of all, the occurrence of universal imperial projects based on the triple structure of military, economic, and ideological cultural power of a single country is as rare as it is ephemeral. So That's why we need to treat the last 30 years as an exception, not as a rule. So the era of unipolarity inaugurated by the United States, in which the planet was shaped according to the liberal, democratic, and globalized values of the only superpower, is already part of the past and will hardly return. So that's the first thing that we have to bear in mind. The world of the future will probably not look like the last 30 years. And for the generation that was born between the 1990s and the early 2000s, the world of the future will be very different from anything you have ever seen. You can go forward, please. Yeah. And as I said before, in order to understand the future, we have to look at the past. And one of the things that I was thinking to myself as the war began is that the future will very likely be more dangerous than the present. So when revisiting the past, our first stop, if we think of ourselves in a time machine, is to go back to the year 1945. And that was the only year in history in which a country has used nuclear weapons against civilian populations. And that was the case of the American bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where between 100,000, 200,000 people died. And it's curious because I never thought of myself discussing the likelihood of a nuclear war in 2022. But today, according to the doomsday clock, which is a device used by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to estimate the likelihood of a widespread human catastrophe with a focus on a nuclear collapse of the world, we are at 100 seconds from midnight, which is the closest point to the apocalypse that we have reached since the end of the Second World War. For some of you who are a little bit older, you might remember Iron Maiden's song, 2 Minutes to Midnight. That was 1984. In the middle of the Cold War, we imagined that we were very close to a nuclear collapse. And apparently we are even closer today. You can move forward, please. The thing about sticking to 1945 is that it's a very ambiguous year. It was the year of the nuclear bombings of Japan, but it was also the year of the greatest multilateral conference that we have known, which was the San Francisco conference in June 1945. So that was the moment when the basic rules of international law and multilateralism were laid out. So sovereignty and self-determination have been considered the cornerstones of the post-war world order. And so that's why we need to move even further back to understand what other elements can we bring from history to understand what the future will look like. So next slide, please. So as a third building block, I'd say that the future will be more unstable, and more unstable, not necessarily in the sense of violence, but in the sense of unpredictability of borders and political relations between countries. So we have to go back to the last quarter of the 19th century. And back then, the world was experiencing escalating political tensions between the European powers, which positioned themselves on geopolitical, nationalist, and imperialist considerations. And curiously enough, the same three ingredients reappear in the interactions between the four major contemporary poles of power, the United States and Europe, China and Russia. And to a large degree, they define the current clashes between these countries. So imperialism, nationalism, and a lot of geopolitical elements to the relationship of great powers, more specifically. So just as in the past, alliances are forming based on the desire to dominate important parts of the globe and leading to an unprecedented arms race. Next slide, please. As a fourth and almost final element, the future will be more civilizational. And I usually resort to constructivist theories of international relations to look into what the future might look like in terms of identity. So never before have we used so often references to the West as a civilization, religion as a part of civilization to shape relations between countries. So we know that Putin in particular has been called a modern day Tsar, and no one questions his desire to rebuild the greatness of the Russian Empire, whose apex was precisely the end of the 19th century. But we have to move even further back to 1453 if we want to understand what the world of the future will look like in terms of its cultural and religious foundations. Back in 1453, Russia was known as Moscow or Moscovia, and it found itself under the rule of Ivan the Great, Ivan III, the Great, who defeated the Mongols, laid the foundations of the Russian state, and tripled Russia's territory. Next slide, please. But the main events of 1453 were the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans and the end of the 100 Years' War between France and England. So before the consolidation of the modern state, we lived in an era of civilizations. In 1453 in particular, the West was at the height of its religious nationalism, which is a feature I assume will be ever more present in the world of the future. And when I say religious nationalism, I refer to these proto-national sentiments that merged with the economic and ideological power of the Catholic Church in the construction of an ambitious national or universal project. But the rest of the world was also going through the civilizational zenith. So under the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese Empire was blossoming, and the Muslims consolidated themselves territorially through the hands of the Ottoman sultans. And nowadays, revisiting Samuel Huntington's very well-known thesis, The Clash of Civilizations, I believe that civilizational, cultural, and religious arguments, they have never been so common to justify and to incite conflicts around the world. Next slide, please. What about Latin America? And that's my final thought on the future world order. I think Latin America has always been and will remain somewhere in the early 19th century in terms of its position in the world order. We have become, in the 20th century, a very industrialized region, but in the beginning, since the beginning of the 21st century, Latin America has once again become part of the world's economic periphery, and especially when it comes to the patterns of exports and international trade involving Latin America. So one of the speculations that we see is that global value chains, they will tend to become more regional in the future, but not necessarily, that's true for Latin America, but not necessarily to the benefit of Latin American countries. So if you look at how the United States and China have been dealing with Latin America, we can imagine that we are about to enter a new era of imperialism and colonialism in the region as well. That's not exclusively related to the war, but that might be a very important building block for the future world order. This is it. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you so much, Professor Casares. I think that was an important reminder for all of us to look back at historical turning points as we try to grasp and understand the implications of what's going on today. So thank you so much. Next up, Professor Christensen from CEPA.
Thanks very much, Professor Hung. I wanted to speak today about how I see the Russian invasion of Ukraine affecting the US-China relationship and the prospect for a new Cold War. I published a couple of pieces over the last couple of years, one in Korea and one in Foreign Affairs, arguing that the US-China strategic competition would not look like the early phases of the Cold War. And I'm rethinking that position now in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'll just lay out the argument in those papers. and then say why the Russian invasion of Ukraine makes me call into question those arguments. First, I argued that China today, unlike Stalin's USSR and Mao's PRC, or importantly, contemporary Russia, is not exporting its political model, seeking to overthrow democratic governments and replacing them with autocracies. So that was a big difference between now, the US-China strategic competition, and the Cold War. A second related argument is that China was too integrated with the global economy to want to alienate its major economic partners by promoting its ideology abroad. And that still the vast majority of China's major economic partners were the United States, its allies and partners around the world. And this would prevent China from wanting to destabilize relations with all of those countries. And from the US side, US allies and partners would be extremely reluctant to join the United States, even if the United States wanted to do it, in containing the Chinese economic growth through various economic measures, as the United States was able to get its allies to do toward the Soviet Union in the early Cold War. And then the third related reason flows from the first two, and that is that you are unlikely to witness two clear blocks in global politics, because you wouldn't have those formations of US alliances and partners lined up against China's rise, and you would not have an alliance bloc led by China. China lacks the allies and lacks the attractiveness to allies. So I said we were unlikely to have something looking like the Cold War in the US-China strategic competition, unless one of two things happened, I argued. One is that China actually became revisionist and started to export its ideology in the way that contemporary Russia and the PRC of the past under Mao, or the USSR under Stalin exported their models. Or if globalization reversed and China was no longer integrated into the international economy the way it is today, and therefore no longer had the incentives to avoid aggravating the United States, its allies and partners, and then maybe it could go down the road of trying to export its model. But all of that made me somewhat optimistic. The US-China strategic competition was still very real in my mind, but it wasn't going to look like the US-Soviet Cold War. And this was important in part because if you had something like the US-Soviet style Cold War, you would have a struggle all around the world very quickly. China lacks power projection capability to challenge around the world with its own military, and will for quite a long time. But if there was a clear divide between blocs around the world, between authoritarian and democratic governments, it would be very easy for China to use proxies, to support proxies, to fight around the world against pro-American proxies. And it would look much more like the Cold War. So I said, this is a good thing that this wasn't going to happen. So why I'm rethinking things is I didn't consider a third possibility that could lead to a kind of Cold War type outcome. And that is that the Chinese president, President Xi, would bind himself tightly to a truly revisionist leader in Vladimir Putin, just before Vladimir Putin exploited that relationship with China, basically using or snookering China into support, and then launching an aggressive war of invasion against a democratic neighbor. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. You have the February 4th joint communique between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, which moved the moved the PRC Russia relationship to a much tighter place than it had been before in publicly locking in the President Xi's prestige to the relationship with Putin. This is done for a range of reasons. Most important, I believe, is ideological, that both stand up to the spread of democracy and color revolutions supported by the United States. And then just after that, I think the Chinese were quite surprised by the expansive invasion of Ukraine, thus putting President Xi in a very difficult spot and putting his advisors in a very, very difficult spot. Which advisor is going to say, President Xi, you messed up. You shouldn't have linked your wagon to this person, and we should abandon him. And the problem is the very predictable sanctions that have been leveled against Russia by most of the advanced economies of the world, not just the West, but also Japan, South Korea, Singapore, have put Russia in a very difficult spot. Xi Jinping wants to support Putin so that he doesn't fall. And this puts China in a very difficult spot. So we're going to see lots of export controls on Russia. We're going to see lots of financial actions against Russia, as you see. And there will be the threat of financial sanctions and export controls against any country that supports Russia. And I believe this war will last a very long time. So China is in a difficult spot. It doesn't want to alienate its advanced economic partners around the world, on whom it still depends, despite a move to self-reliance, which will take a long time. And you have a situation in which the United States, and increasingly the United States allies and partners, will be pressuring China not to help Russia. And what you could end up with is a series of secondary sanctions on China and a series of export controls on China, if the belief is if you sell anything to China, that will end up in Russian hands, undercutting the sanctions on Russia. There's a philosophical shift. You hear it in US rhetoric, which is a little bit less surprising, but much more in European rhetoric, and even in Japanese rhetoric, which is that the world is being divided between democracies and authoritarian states. And that is a very dramatic change. This has real implications for how the United States and how other countries view cross-strait relations between the mainland and Taiwan. Much of the restraint on support for Taiwan has been based on the idea that this is fundamentally a sovereignty issue, Chinese sovereignty, and it's not worth poking China in the eye on its sovereignty concerns and its nationalism, even though there's an ideological difference across the strait. I'm concerned that the Russian invasion of Ukraine underscores the difference between authoritarianism and democracy, and many people will view cross-strait relations purely through the lens of an autocratic mainland threatening a democratic Taiwan. And we saw an op-ed yesterday by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe calling for an unconditional commitment to Taiwan by the United States along these very lines. So it's not just an American thing. And I'll just close by saying there's a parallel in history. I believe that Putin has used President Xi, exploited President Xi, snookered President Xi, putting the PRC in this difficult position. And the historical analogy is the spring of 1950, when Kim Il-sung and Joseph Stalin manipulated Mao into a position of supporting North Korean invasion of South Korea, an outcome that really changed all of the PRC's foreign policy portfolio and led to the mainland losing Taiwan and forming a lot of the tensions between the United States and the PRC that followed, and massive economic sanctions on China that actually exceeded the sanctions that were on the Soviet Union at the time. So that's what I'm concerned about, the road we're going down. There's a historical precedent for it. China's tried to be very careful in its support of Russia to avoid these kinds of outcomes in terms of economic pressure against it. How long that can be sustained if Putin's regime seems to be in trouble over time is an open question. And a lot of what will happen will be determined by what the Chinese government decides to do. Does it really want to fully side with this brutal revisionist Russia, or does it want to be part of the modern advanced world in a world of globalization? And unfortunately, and I say it out of sadness, not out of anger, unfortunately, President Putin has put China in that terrible position. And I think it's the thing to watch in terms of global politics moving forward. And I will stop there. Thanks to the organizers and thanks to the incredible staff who put this together and even got me organized so early in the morning. So thanks to everyone.
Thanks very much, Professor Christensen. I think I'd be really fascinated to learn more about your views on the Putin-Xi relationship, sort of the dynamics between the two, and how sustainable this China-Russia relationship might be going forward as a result of the tensions and the pressures that we've just identified. So I guess we can maybe discuss that later in the Q&A session. So thank you so much. Next up, we have Professor Wall from the Hertie School. Over to you. First of all, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Professor Heng, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for getting us together. What I propose to do now is to move from the reconfiguration of the world order to the immediate reactions we currently see unfolding in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in particular, I'd like to talk about the politics of sanction. I have a PowerPoint. If we can pull it up, you can see some of the pictures. And I would just like to introduce to those of you who might not be familiar with sanctions and economic statecraft, which is, of course, an important literature, some insights first on how little they actually achieve most of the time, why we still use them, and what the impact of the politics of sanctions can be. So I want to make 3 short points. The first is the paradox of sanctions. The second is the immediate impact we now see in this interconnected world in which we are. And then I would like to go to solutions that we can envision in order to move forward in this era. So economic sanctions, we now have heard a lot also on the radio because, of course, it becomes a very important question, has been a tool of statecraft since the beginning of the 20th century. And it's not a very efficient type of intervention. We think that cutting a country or cutting individual people off from the world economy will coerce them into choices that they wouldn't otherwise make. But what we see is actually that sanctions are ambivalent. In a very important book, Mulder has shown that in the interwar years, they even backfired because economic sanctions generally hit civilians and the population much more than the government that's making decisions, and can create a lot of support for authoritarian regimes, which happened, for example, in Italy. What still is noteworthy about sanctions is that in the last decades in which they're used, and they have moved as a tool of economic statecraft, mainly from the United Nations to the US, who uses it as a tool of foreign policy. Sanctions work not by coercing the opponents into different actions. They work through anticipation because an adversary government might know that it could be subject to sanctions. It actually behaves much longer in line with certain objectives that are defended than one would expect. And this has been argued by Dan Dressner in a book called The Sanctions Paradox. What we also see over time is that sanctions are widely used. Today, about 1/3 of the world's population is subject to some form of sanctions. And we can see that the use of them increased over time, also by different types and with different objectives. So you can see that the initial use was rather timid, one might say. They're widely used also in very specific areas such as the fight against terrorism or organized crime, human rights violations, and others. They're not necessarily in the context of a military aggression, as we now see in Ukraine. So it's been widely expected, and we've seen now that sanctions are used in multiple areas and by a lot of countries against Russia. Both in very general sanctions and very targeted sanctions, what one calls smart sanctions, which includes the freezing of assets, the targeting of specific sectors, companies, and people. Now, the challenge with sanctions, let me see if I can move forward to the next slide. Since it's not reacting, if somebody else can move my slides. The challenge of sanctions is that sanctions always hit the opponent as much as one is affected by sanctions from the country that's sending them, simply because we're in an interconnected economy. We now have the first studies estimating the economic impact of the war on both dimensions such as growth and inflation, which we can expect. And you can see here the figures the OECD has brought together. And as one would expect, we can see a very important impact on GDP, but also on inflation in the areas that are closest to Russia or most connected to Russia. The euro area here stands out, but the rest of the world is affected as well. And this impact goes, of course, through commodity prices, it goes through the supply chain, it goes into energy markets. Here you see commodity prices. So depending on what a country is producing, if you need the nickel or the coal or if you rely on wheat imports from Ukraine, you are more affected than if you are in other contexts. What has been most discussed is energy dependence. So I wanted to show you the reliance on Russian energy imports across the world. And you see that for some countries, playing with the idea of an embargo is much more costly than for others. And in particular, Central and Eastern Europe are, of course, very reliant on Russian oil, on Russian gas, on Russian coal. So a full embargo, as has been discussed, is something that will require and would require a plan for cooperation with these countries who will not have any means to ensure their energy supply if they cut off ties with Russia. And you see here that the countries that are most on the left have sometimes even above 100% of their energy supply because it concerns stocks as well. But even countries, we've heard a lot about German dependence on Russian energy. You see Germany here in the middle with 30% of their total energy supply coming from Russia. And I will say a word more about this in the future. You see that this is an issue that is unequally distributed and therefore a subject for a very skilled international cooperation if one wanted to go forward, because the costs will be borne quite unevenly. If we can move to the next slide, I would like to discuss more what can happen in the case of Germany. There are many calls now to say we have to move to a full embargo on Russian energy, and the government is hesitant to do so, certainly because of industry pressure, because there will be an impact that is evident on the economy. And the first studies that have now been discussed quite largely widely, including by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz himself, is that we get to a GDP decline that is estimated somewhere between 0.5 and 3% of output. But it can be more important depending on how well the German government would manage the substitution of gas, to manage the storage facilities, and this affects, of course, the timing and the impact overall. We can also see, if you move to the next slide, which I think is a visual summary. So let me skip over this. This is the percentage, if we can move one slide down. How much of this output impact would be borne by the population? If we had output costs just in terms of GDP below 1% of GDP, it means that the costs would be 80 to 120 euros per citizen per year. And one might say, well, that's something we can possibly handle. If they are higher, such as 2 to 2.5% of GDP, this increases to 1,000 euros per German citizen over a year. But this comes on top of what would then be the effect of energy prices, which we can see rising. And you can very quickly imagine that it could be politically difficult to say to the German citizens, you should bear these costs, and you will have, of course, energy prices affected as well. I'm saying this, I will say something against it afterwards, but you see that it's a real political challenge for governments to bring their population to accept costs that are borne within a country with very different socioeconomic impacts depending on the groups that are affected, if, and this is my big if the government doesn't intervene politically to redistribute these costs and to make the burden bearable for those that can least handle it. I'll point to Latin America. We've watched in Peru the outrage to rising energy prices. That gives you an image, with 4 people who've died in street protests, that gives you an image of where you could get to if you leave energy hikes unmitigated, and if you don't help the sectors that will be most affected by this, because many sectors might not be touched, and those that are reliant on oil or gas will be considerably impacted. And in this, the effects of a possible embargo are exactly comparable to the pandemic. That once the pandemic has hit certain sectors such as tourism or event management or restaurants have been impacted to a point where, had they not received government support, they would have disappeared. GDP was impacted in Germany by 4.5%, so much more than the estimations here show. But it also tells you that this is politically viable only if the government tries to come in with a support rescue package in order to mitigate these costs, distribute them evenly, and have it be a politically acceptable solution. And that is the whole challenge. And this is just the discussion of Germany. We can go to the next slide. It is obviously the challenge for the rest of the world as well. You need to think politically how to cushion a shock that will necessarily come not just from the war if it goes on as it currently is, but also from possible reactions through economic sanctions. And this means national political solutions, but it more than that also means international cooperation around what will be then a public good, trying to intervene in order to create a more peaceful world. And that means that, for example, within Europe, we need to come to a solution for the management of the European energy market, and that is necessarily difficult. We've heard some countries already say that they don't want to carry the costs of the energy choices and the energy dependence of those countries that are hardest hit. We also have heard proposals, for example, from the Spanish and Portuguese government that would like a collective market intervention on energy prices, and other countries will say market intervention will create the opposite effect and is a bad idea. So as all political solutions, we will have a lot of arguments, discussions about how to intervene. My only point is, if we do not decide how to intervene collectively, how to coordinate substitution strategies, we are not going to go very far. And this is true for Europe, but it's also true for the world. Of course, this means that in order to react to the Russian aggression of Ukraine and to have a chance of affecting the war, we need to make sure it doesn't lead to beggar thy neighbor policies, to policies of companies that want to win an advantage out of a recompositioning of the energy market right now. And that really means that in a moment of crisis that actually looks rather gloomy, as we've heard from the first two presentations, this is really a moment where international cooperation is key to get us out of where we currently are. And I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. If you go one slide further, you get the cartoon at the end, but I'm done speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, first of all. And I think your analysis of sanctions is absolutely crucial for for a broader understanding of the Western sort of global response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think some of the points that you mentioned about how much sanctions actually do achieve. I think that's something we could explore further in the Q&A session. So thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Nazruleva from the LSE. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. I'm not sure if I could have my slides up, please. That would be great, but thank you. So I'll try to. So I think what I would like to focus on in the 8 minutes that I have is kind of zoom in a bit more and follow up on some of the comments that were made before. So one of them, I guess, is related to how stable is the current regime given the events that are unfolding and the kind of unprecedented economic and financial sanctions that are placed on Russia. And then given that these sanctions also influence the broad population in Russia, okay, so it works. So the next question would be, so what is that? Is there any effect? So I am actually focused a lot in my research and my expertise is mostly on Russia and authoritarian politics in Russia. So we have some new data in, you might have seen this before, about public opinion in Russia. These are the numbers that came from Levada at the end of March. And Putin's approval rating as of March is actually people who say, the percentage of people who say they support Putin's activities as the president is 83%, according to Levada, with only 15% who disapprove his actions. And then but this effect is not only limited to the approval ratings of Putin. I think my clicker doesn't work. Okay, oh, perfect. So on the next slide, we can actually see that a lot of indicators reported by Levada on a monthly basis. Okay, so I think my clicker glitches a little bit. Actually, a lot of approval ratings go up. So in addition to Putin's approval, there's also a question about whether the public believes that the country is moving in the right direction. So what we see is that about 70% of people actually, as of March, say that, no, yes, the country is moving in the right direction, and only about 20% say that the country is on the wrong track. So the next question that, is obvious is, what is actually going on in Russia, and does it mean that the regime is stable, and how we can unpack what happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what the regime does to kind of ensure. So what part of this support is actually sincere, and what part of this could be attributed to the falsified preferences? So I want to mention several dimensions usually studied in authoritarian politics. So this is repression, censorship, and propaganda. So at March 4th, there's a new kind of intensified cycle of repression that started. The criminal code was amended to include the punishment for discussing the activities of the Russian armed forces in a negative light. So whatever is not reflecting the official narrative of the government would be considered false information. And then the punishment for this is from fines to up to 10 and 15 years in prison, with 15 years in prison for grave consequences, which is also something that the government decides on. But in light of this, so when you think about public opinion, it really depends on what kind of questions are currently asked in Russia, because the respondents could face real consequences. But this is just part of the story, because yes, of course, even before we know about repression, censorship, and propaganda in Russia, but this has intensified after the end of February, as now we also have, so a lot of informational sources that were previously independent from the government, they are now either blocked or closed. So you might have heard about the closure of the most prominent radio stations, Echo of Moscow, that existed in Russia since the 1990s. The same is true about the Novaya Gazeta, that was also available in print and online, and existed since 1993. And then also the independent TV station TV Rain was closed. So that all happened within the months of the invasion of Ukraine. And in addition, now Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are banned in Russia. There's also some discussion about banning Wikipedia and possibly YouTube. And a lot of news websites where the public could get some alternative narratives about the war are also currently blocked. Of course, there's, you could install VPN and try to access all these news sources. And there is some evidence that the most downloaded applications nowadays in Russia are the VPN services. But of course, you need to make this additional steps to circumvent censorship. But what is left? So what's left is mostly state-run news outlets and state-run TV channels. And they also intensified the coverage of the government-run narrative. So for example, on Channel 1, a lot of previous entertainment shows that existed and were translated for a while were replaced with more informational talk shows and news coverage. So on all these dimensions, censorship and propaganda intensified. But, oh, if you could help me, please, could I get to the next slide? I think I lost my clicker. Thank you. But what I want to highlight is something based on also on my own research, and I don't think this is currently discussed enough in the existing coverage of what's going on, is the so-called not just repression, but preventive repression. So this is also something from the past, and that existed in the Soviet era. So what we observe these days is that intensification of the so-called preventive or prophylactic chats conducted with people, so you don't need to get arrested. These are just preventive warnings, mostly issued to the young population, such as students in the universities. So for any types of behavior that would be considered hostile, so in the Soviet era, you could get into trouble for telling anti-Soviet jokes. So now it's anything that's deemed by the government as false information or anti-regime sentiments, you could get into trouble, and then someone from the police or the Secret Service could invite you for a prophylactic discussion. Historically, this practice was also focused a lot on the impression of the young, because these are, future generations that would still kind of be there for a while. So it seems that the current regime is not only worried about the adult population, but also is trying to shape and mold future generations, which I think is very troublesome. And if we could get to the next slide, please. So what is also related, and I think it's currently also started to be discussed, is that propaganda is not limited to the media. So propaganda exists in the education system a lot. So what happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that you could see reports in the news about the so-called all Russian patriotic lessons that are now conducted at schools, where basically teachers receive very detailed instructions of how to discuss the war in Ukraine with their students. And this discussion is, repeats the same narrative that's promoted by the state media. And what's actually, so this discussion is not even limited to the discussion of the war itself. Of course, they cannot call it the war, as you probably know, so they call it a special operation. But there's also some evidence that, for example, now there was a special lesson conducted in April about how to discuss the effect of sanctions. So I guess the narrative says that, it's, yes, there's import substitution, so the effect is not going to be on Russia. So this is the, the world is going to suffer more than our country. So I think that's also interesting because all these kind of talking points seem to be covered. But what's related to the preventive repression that I mentioned on the previous slide is that students can actually inform on their teachers. So there are now reports in the media that if teachers express anti-war sentiments in the classroom, they could get into trouble because students report them to the school authorities. And these teachers, they could be fired, or they could even face a real term, kind of prison term. But this process actually, so again, this is not something that appeared only after, February 24th in the invasion of Ukraine. This existed before. So during the consolidation of the regime in the 2000s, there was this discussion of rewriting history and how we think about historical memory and the narrative about the Second World War. And this intensified with annexation of Crimea. So in 2014, Vladimir Putin promoted this idea about the single concept history textbook. And finally, these textbooks with the unified narrative promoted by the government were published in 2021. And there's some preliminary studies that show that actually, yes, they rewrote a lot about how the annexation of Crimea is discussed. They rewrote a lot about repression under Stalin. So this is something that was kind of building up to that moment and now intensified. And I guess to kind of get to the very last slide that I wanted to bring up is, could we show the very last slide? Thank you. So given all this given that censorship, propaganda, and repression intensified and now are not limited to schools, I guess what I wanted to highlight is whenever you see any public opinion survey data from Russia, one thing to keep in mind is one thing that I guess I keep asking myself too is to what extent this support is sincere. And finally, we actually from Philip Tchaikovsky and Max Schaub, they just conducted an experiment with Yandex Toloka and published the results on the LSE blog on April 6th, when they tried to disentangle, if we really zoom in and focus not just on the support for Putin, because that might be different from the support for the war, and ask a question about whether the public supports the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are different versions how these questions could be asked. There are some survey data that actually uses this official way to ask the question and ask about the special operation. And all this survey data from March, they show that the support is about 60 and 70%. But in this study, the two researchers, what they asked this question directly and also tried to ask this question using the sensitive survey techniques when basically we are not asking the question directly to help the respondents to kind of avoid, because there's now a real kind of jail term that you could face for disagreeing with the regime. What they find is that, yes, the direct question would give about 70% support, and with list experiment asking this question in a sensitive way, this support goes down to 53%, but yes, it's still very high. So I guess what is working? Is it propaganda? Is it something else? It's still a question. This is probably still too early to see what will what happened, because as you know, with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when we saw this big jump in public opinion, which was explained by the rally around the flag effect, I guess we'll see how stable it is, given the effect of the sanctions could be delayed. But unfortunately, this is still bad news, because even 53% is quite high support. So that's just kind of to wrap up the discussion about how stable is the regime. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Nazareva. I think your point, you got a real puzzle there. How do we make sense of these approval ratings? And I think how sincere are those responses as well? So that's a real puzzle that you need to tackle, I think. So we can move, I think, into the next sort of moderated discussion amongst the panelists for the next 10 minutes or so. I think all the different panelists have raised a wide range of issues from the importance of history, US-China relations, sanctions, and domestic approval ratings, regime stability. Does any one of you on the panel want to comment or respond to each other's presentations?
Let's hear from the audience.
Okay, then we can move to the Q&A session then. So we can open up the Q&A to the audience who have joined us today. And let me see if we can pick up some questions. Let's see. Okay, we have a first question from Danny from the LKY school. Danny's question is to Tom. On your last point about who China will side with, you will agree that China will choose by determining what's best for itself. What concrete actions by China would indicate to you that its choice has not been to side with Russia? What actions might the rest of the world take, whether carrot or stick, that will nudge China not to side with Russia? Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Danny. It seems to me that what people will be watching are, first of all, diplomatic signals from China. And so far, we haven't seen very positive ones from the outside. Basically, a refusal to condemn the Russian invasion. And additionally, the rebroadcasting of Russian propaganda about the war, about how it's progressing, using the same propagandistic language, refusing to call it an invasion, and also pushing out arguments about sensitive laboratories in Ukraine allegedly run by the United States, pushing out propaganda about the expansion of NATO and the real cause of the conflict. So that's been very negative so far, and I think that's underscored all the negative dynamics that I laid out in my talk. On the positive side, we haven't seen certain things. So there were initial reports of a potential weapons transfers from China to Russia. It turns out the Chinese deny that, and it turns out that even the US government officials have said they see no evidence of such transfers, which is encouraging. We haven't seen any public evidence of hard currency transfers in violation of the US or European Union sanctions, which is a positive sign because that's really what Russia needs most. But on the negative side, there have been public reports in Bloomberg and elsewhere that China is using soft currency trade credits to facilitate the purchase of large amounts of energy from Russia. So what Russia will end up with a lot of renminbi, probably something Russia didn't really want at the beginning of all this, but it's something. And I think how the United States and the Europeans view that trend over time will help determine the reactions of advanced economies moving forward. And why is this all happening? I'm firmly of the belief that this has much more to do with China's concern about Putin's regime stability and the implications for the Chinese Communist Party in China if Putin's regime gets into trouble. And I think this has been bad for the CCP in China and a whole range of reasons, most important of which is a relatively stable situation in Moscow became unstable because of Putin's choices to be so aggressive. That's one of the great ironies of this war, is that there's very little evidence that Putin was in any kind of trouble before the war. Eugenia can speak much more authoritatively than I can about this. But this war over time can put him in trouble, and that's worrisome to the Chinese Communist Party. So they will be tempted to support him to prevent that outcome. And the world will be watching, Danny, what China does. And that could have huge implications for Chinese foreign policy. I don't think that's a welcome challenge in China. But again, I don't know which Chinese advisor is going to go to President Xi and say, you messed up, we need to fundamentally change course. That's not really how that system works. That's not a great survival skill for that advisor. So in a sense, both the CCP and Putin's regime suffer from the same autocratic problem, that it's very difficult to get what political scientists and economists call Bayesian updating, with critical reference to negative news in a world in which the great leader needs to be praised and only supported. And I think that's a problem in both systems.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. We have a bunch of questions sort of clustering around sanctions. So I suppose this will go to Professor Wold. Questions from Joe Tamura, one of our students actually at GRASP. And he's asking about sanctions and if sanctions are an ineffective means to address Russian invasion. Is there any other viable option to cope with this aggression? And also, how does Germany's previous government's optimistic view towards Russia affect the economic impact of sanctions on Germany? And wasn't there any chance to reconsider the interdependence with Russia after the Crimea annexation? Professor Wold.
Yes, thank you, Joe, for these questions. Are there other options if economic sanctions don't work? Of course, there are military options, and they're currently being used. You can help with equipment. You can join an alliance and actually enter the war. You can help with equipment. You can do all the classic military support measures, and several of them are being done. But short of going into a military conflict outright, economic statecraft is the main alternative. And economic sanctions sounds like it's one tool, but it's really 100 different tools. And the question is, which mix do you use and what do you do? Do you work? We heard about the currency. We heard about trade isolation. We heard about specific actions, for example, cutting the Russian banks out of the payment systems, and oil embargo. All of these are used and useful. And I said sanctions are not very effective, but they are, and that's why they're used. They still hurt a lot. And the objective now for the countries that want to enter into this conflict without joining it outright in military form is to increase the cost of war for Russia. And all of the economic sanctions will increase the cost of war, and that is precisely why they're used. And the goal here is to make the calculation on the Russian government side incorporate this rising cost of war. And I actually have to say, I do think that is more successful than one would have expected, simply because, and it's been said before, Vladimir Putin did not expect to have such a united front against him. He did not expect to have such a swift European reaction, such a massive European reaction, the complete alignment of the US and the European policies, which haven't been the case in the past. And you mentioned Germany, so let me remind everybody who doesn't have it on their radar screen that Germany, of course, has been opposed to some of the US sanctions in particular because it wanted to make different energy choices and build Nord Stream 2, a gas pipeline coming directly into Germany and making Germany more reliant on Russian gas and circumvening the former pipeline which was going through Ukraine. So these choices are, of course, today on everybody's mind, and they shed a very bad light on the former German governments, which are no longer in power. The election has taken place this winter. So the performance of the Merkel era looks very bleak because of a very misjudgment about the real threat coming from Russia and the consequential energy choices that have been made. That is clear to most people, and it's also clear that the most the center of the misjudgment came out of political parties, in particular the SPD, the center-left party, which is under fire now because Gerhard Schröder, as most people know, is even on the board of Gazprom and still very connected to Russia and has not reneged on these board memberships as most other politicians have done around the world. And one of the very close allies of Gerhard Schröder is Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor, who's also been part of the Merkel government. So that legacy is under fire, much criticized, and puts the German government in an uncomfortable position because, of course, that is what's at stake now. And if one wanted to really intervene with much determination in this war, one would have to do a very, very radical break with the past.
Professor Hung, can I say something about this? Because I want to answer Danny's question more fully along the lines that Professor Bull just laid out so well. And that has to do with export controls. So there are very severe export controls on Russia right now from the Europeans and from the United States in particular, Japan as well. And this is where China gets put in the crosshairs as well. So if you think of two key industries, semiconductors and microchips in general, and the production of them, not just the actual chips, but the equipment that produces them. If China tries to bail out Russia's economy by transferring semiconductors to Russia, which are required for almost everything that works these days, and there are sanctions on China that follow in the semiconductor industry, particularly in the equipment that makes semiconductors, this will have a devastating impact on the Chinese economy. So that's a very tough choice, as Danny lays out, for China to make moving forward. The second is aviation parts. Commercial aircraft are absolutely dominated by the Europeans and the United States, Boeing and Airbus. And Russia will receive no parts for its domestic and international airlines. And those things need constant maintenance. Will China backfill those and therefore have its own aviation industry cut off from Airbus and from Boeing? That would be a very tough choice. So China has very tough choices. I don't think China welcomes these choices. And that's why I say this out of sadness, not out of anger, that Putin has put China in a terrible place. So to finish the answer to Danny, it's not in China's national interest to support Putin. It's in China's national interest to distance itself from Putin, but it may be in the Chinese Communist Party's domestic interest to support Putin anyway.
Thanks very much, Tom, for the follow-up response. We have a question actually, again, on sort of the economic dimensions of sanctions, and also this time about sort of Russia's response. And this question comes from Alcion Moura from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the question is as follows. Russia has introduced a de facto gold standard. The central bank has set a fixed exchange rate of the ruble against gold for the time being until June the 30th in the amount of 5,000 rubles per gram. So as a result, the ruble immediately becomes heavier, and its rate against the dollar and the euro now fluctuates in a small band associated with supply and demand of the currency. So in this way, dollars and euros are said to be becoming superfluous. How do you think this Russian response has affected the US and Europe? I suppose this might once again go to Professor Wall.
I'm not sure if I'm the best person qualified to speak about this because I'm not a very good expert on monetary policy. If somebody else wants to take it, I'd happily pass it on.
Does anyone on the panel want to address this question?
I can only speak to it abstractly, and that is that there's a global financial market that's still very reliant on the dollar. And if Russian banks can't use the dollar, there's very few measures they can raise to really save their economy from very severe fallout. They can come up with clever solutions, but they won't be long-term solutions that really benefit the Russian economy, in my opinion.
Thanks very
and
much.
Maybe what I can say is if I was Vladimir Putin, what I would be most concerned about is my monetary policy. And I see this de facto gold standard that he's trying to create as an emergency measure to the same degree that his attempt to pressure all the energy importers into payment in rubles in order to strengthen his ruble. I think the Russian central bank, which has also had its reserves frozen abroad, and that's a substantial time, is having a very difficult time. Is just a couple of moments short of printing more money, which will create inflation in Russia. And the weak point in Russia's economic stability is monetary policy. So I don't think the dollar and the euro are superfluous. I agree with Professor Christensen that the dollar still has the exorbitant privilege of being the source of political power in the world economy. I think the ruble is in a bad position since yesterday or the day before. Russia has defaulted on its foreign debt. And all of these are, for me, rather signs that the Russian economy is at the point of breaking and that it's going to be a very, very tough game to play for Vladimir Putin.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess we could move on to another question, this time perhaps looking at the broader consequences and implications on areas that are beyond the immediate conflict zones. And this is a question from Bradley Murray, who's actually an incoming student to GRASP. And he's asking the panel for thoughts on destabilizing effects of the war in Ukraine outside of Europe. So, alongside, global food shortages and protests over economic impact, there's also been risks highlighted around the breakout of conflict in the Caucasus, the Middle East. Here in Japan, actually, we've also seen suspension of talks between Russia and Japan over the northern territories. Could the panel assess how the war might destabilize areas beyond the immediate area of conflicts? I think this question was quite similar to what I had in mind for Professor Casaroche, and thinking about Latin America and Latin America's response as well to the Russian invasion. So maybe I could ask Professor Casaroche for your comments.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me just pick up on something from the last question. Just a quick comment on that. There was a lot of speculation going around when European countries were deciding whether to cut Russia out of the SWIFT structures, right? And one of the things that people claimed back in the day was that it could accelerate a global transition away from the dollar and towards a strong Chinese currency, right? The Chinese currency would lead the future of the world. And I think that I agree with Tom that from what we can see at this point, it seems to me that China doesn't want this transition to take place at the expense of global economic instability. And this is why China has become one of the leading diplomatic powers to try and mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The fact that we have three very unlikely players in this new world of diplomacy, China, Israel, and Turkey, might be a sign that that traditional structures of diplomacy are gone, and maybe we have new actors trying to bring over some new elements to this discussion, and perhaps there will be a tacit acceptance of authoritarian regimes, or democracy will not be a precondition anymore for these negotiations to be carried out. But when it comes to Latin America in particular, I see that one of the things that I very briefly touched upon in my presentation is that we might be witnessing a transformation in the structure of global value chains, and they will probably become a little bit more regionalized in the future, and that also applies to Latin America. So I've seen from a Brazilian perspective, I've seen talks between Brazilian authorities and Mexican, Colombian, and Argentinian authorities to maybe restructure some productive chains regionally to cope with some of the shortages that present as an outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and that's particularly true for fertilizers. So one of the strongest cooperation areas when it comes to Latin America, because of the heavy dependency on agricultural exports, is how not to depend on Russian and Ukrainian fertilizers from this point on. And I think that we might see some new patterns of cooperation emerge between countries which are actually very close to each other, as in the case of Brazil and Bolivia, or Brazil and some Caribbean countries, because they were integrated in the global economy in very different ways. But now it seems that there is an effort going on to restructure these chains regionally. Brazil, unfortunately, is not in the right position to play a leading role in this right now because of Bolsonaro's administration that has pretty much isolated itself from the world, and it has adopted a very ambiguous position regarding the conflict in Eastern Europe. So our Ministry of Foreign Affairs tends to vote in favor of Ukraine in international fora, such as the United Nations, but at the same time, Bolsonaro himself has been very systematically praising and speaking in favor of Putin. So that's a very different situation from the one we used to have back in the days, say 2014, for example, when Brazil decided to sit on the fence, but in a much less ambiguous way, right? Because of the BRICS and all. But nowadays, it's not so much a matter within the BRICS. It's more an ambiguity within the government itself. So we might see some restructuring. We might see some prosperity emerging from this new pattern of cooperation in Latin America when it comes to production, industrial, but mostly agricultural production. But I think we'll have to wait until the next cycle of elections. We're going to have national elections in Brazil in October, so we have to wait until the next government to take office. So maybe it's something that will truly start happening as of 2023.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Casares. We have another question this time, once again from Denny. And this time it's for Eugenia. And Denny's asking, did I read right the survey results, which seem to show a rise in public approval of Putin and agreeing that Russia is moving in the right direction? So the censorship, preventive policing, informers that you described in your research explain why no one would speak up negatively against Putin's regime. But what is the mindset in Russians when they speak approvingly or positively of Putin, and what research sort of exists on this aspect? Eugenia.
Thank you very much for this question. It's actually, so there's now an emerging field of research asking precisely this question. So is there sincere support for autocrats? Because we hear a lot about, public approval ratings. And I guess what we don't really have consistent evidence on is what part of it is real. And there are now amazing studies about China. There is now a new working paper by Katerina Tertichna from UCL that basically trying to argue that part of this approval of Putin is also endogenous, because there's some kind of updating that happens in the heads of the kind of general public, is that if they hear often that Putin is very popular, they kind of endogenize this concept, and they could adjust how they answer this question based on the kind of framing narrative that they would receive before the question. So yes, and we do see the increase in public opinion if we trust the data from Levada. I guess in addition, so we cannot yet establish the causal link that all of these mechanisms I mentioned lead to the higher approval ratings. There is, the speculation that the rally around the flag effect might be at work again. It's not that easy to disentangle the effect of kind of the support for the current actions of the government and the support of Russian invasion of Ukraine from the effect of economic sanctions, because there's an argument about the effect of economic sanctions saying that, the public support, the public could unite. So this is Russia against the world. So there's this additional effect, but they usually come together, right? So even in 2014, that wasn't that easy to causally say what was, contributing. So Timothy Fry from Columbia actually has a paper about the 2014 events and annexation of Crimea. And his argument is that we don't really see this the effect of the sanctions per se. So there was a rally around the flag effect of coming from the the support of the annexation of Crimea, mostly than the trying to unite against the economic sanctions imposed on Russia. So yes, I think it's a very good research question. We'll definitely see more research on it. So I'm also part of the project with the University of Glasgow, that sort of studies democratic backsliding, and with a focus on all these different mechanisms, and especially education, because this is it's not a short-term response, it's a long-term strategy, especially if autocrats believe that they would remain in power for a very long time, they start reforming their educational systems too. And I guess I just wanted to add, on the previous question about the exchange rate, I'm also not a specialist on monetary politics, but there's a really great op-ed published in the Project Syndicate by Professor Sergei Guriev, basically asking precisely this question. So you might want to check it out. It's called The Incredible Bouncing Ruble. So just to echo the comments from the colleagues, is to what extent, given the trade restrictions on the foreign currency currently in Russia, to what extent this exchange rate that's now stabilized is real. And I think, so Professor Guriev actually mentions that, there was the newspaper Pravda that published the exchange rate of ruble in the Soviet era, but we everyone knew that there wasn't a real exchange rate. So there's lots of skepticism about this policy, and of course, in the long run, it's going to hurt the economy more than it's going to stabilize it right now.
Professor Hangen, I could say something about public opinion.
Yes,
I really enjoyed Professor Nazarbayeva's presentation, because it was subtle about the problems of censorship and had that list experiment worked in, which is very clever. There's a parallel case in China. They asked Chinese citizens whether they support the government, and unsurprisingly, the rates are extremely high. Sometimes 80%, sometimes even higher support for the government. But then if you ask the questions in clever fashion, as some social scientists have, the results can be kind of shocking in comparison. So there was an Asia Barometer survey several years ago that asked Chinese citizens not whether they support their government, but what government they would want, what type of government they would want to see in their own country in 20 years that exists today. And only 8% of Chinese citizens chose the Chinese form of government now as the kind of government they would want to see in China in 20 years. And Danny will appreciate this. The number one choice was Singapore. It was a plurality, not a majority. Singapore was the type that they wanted, but the United States got about 27%, as I recall. as compared to 8% for the Chinese government. And that's a way for Chinese citizens to express themselves without necessarily getting in trouble, because they're not directly criticizing the Chinese government. They're just talking about what kind of government they would like to see.
Thanks so much, Tom. So I'm afraid we are almost at the end of today's webinar. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I think we can ask each of our panelists for some concluding remarks, 2 minutes each. Perhaps we can start with Professor Casares.
Well, I'm very happy to have participated of this webinar. I'm thrilled to be able to hear all your thoughts about what's going on in Ukraine right now. And we have touched upon many different issues, many different aspects of this conflict. A few things we fell short of mentioning. And one of the things that I think we should keep thinking about is what's going to happen to the state of democracy in Ukraine. What will be the future of democracy in Ukraine? Will democracy be sustainable after the war or under Russian influence or occupation for the future? I think that this is something that I'd like to have mentioned this before, but I think that that's an important thing that we have to keep in the back of our minds whenever we're thinking about the unfolding of the conflict. And of course, thank you so much for the interaction, the questions, and even though I've painted a very bleak picture of the future world order, I think that there's still a lot of room for change and transformation. Of course, we do not live in a deterministic world where history repeats itself or where the structural conditions of the world shape the entirety of international relations. So I think there is a lot of room for us to make sure that we won't let the world become part of our worst nightmares in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Professor Wall.
Well, I'd like to make a very broad statement. We were asked what the global impact of the war in Ukraine was, and one of the questions was the effects far beyond the specific site of this conflict. And I'd like to claim in a bit broader terms that I think the global impact of this war is that it changes everything. I think the world order, we've heard this, that we thought we were in is recomposing, and we will talk about it before and an after of this war, simply because we now recognize that the front lines in the world are closer to a Cold War setup than what we have seen in the past, in the last 30 years. I think this really is a pivotal moment in redefining what is going to be a struggle between liberal democratic orders and governments with more authoritarian tendencies, or that are all the way over on the other side. And this is a dividing line that runs between countries and within countries. I'd like to call your attention to the French elections that are currently going on, with one candidate, Emmanuel Macron, defending a liberal democratic pro-European and internationally open project, and 3 candidates behind him, including the one that's in the runoff, with almost 50% of the votes going to her, Marine Le Pen, with an authoritarian sovereignist or nationalist project. So this will define political conflict in the world within countries for years to come, and the effects will be massive. One of the questions from the audience was, what are faraway effects? And I would just like to use this to make a call to study international relations and come to one of our public policy schools, because if you look at the effects of the Cold War on politics in all sorts of dimensions, you find very surprising effects that people wouldn't have talked about had we had this discussion in 1990 or 1989, or right at the moment where the Berlin Wall came down. But if you're not aware of it, please go and study the link between the end of the Cold War and the breakdown of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and how these are connected. So you have So you have civil movements connected to this. You have internal politics. You have the recompositioning of alliances in faraway places that will be affected by this. So I'd like to make the grandiose statement that the global impact of the war in Ukraine will be with us for decades to come.
Thank you, Professor Wall. Dr. Nazarbayeva.
I guess I just want to thank everyone again for organizing this workshop and the opportunity to present. And I guess one of the comments that I wanted to make is that what was I think maybe missing from the panel is although this is on the global effect of the war in Ukraine, but I think it would be really amazing to hear more from Ukrainian scholars, because of course it's, we're discussing the economic effect and financial and other sanctions and how it takes a very long time, but this is, real war in Ukraine in the meantime, and these are real human lives. So I think that in a lot of that, this very political science economics mindset is, for me as a scholar, is kind of in conflict with kind of personal effects of the war. And I think that that would be really amazing to keep this in mind for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, on that note, GRASP has organized a panel 2 weeks ago where we actually were fortunate enough to have a Ukrainian scholar speaking as one of our panelists. So I think we will be posting this video online on our website. So I think we can share this with our GPPN partners. I think we would be delighted if people would help us disseminate the video as well. Professor Christensen.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was a great panel. Thanks to everyone who's involved. We talked about global impact. That was our topic, right? So I think one of the great ironies of this war is that President Putin apparently did this for two purposes. One is to bolster his domestic legitimacy through a use of Russian nationalism that includes enveloping Ukraine into the Russian nation. And a second is to weaken US-led alliances around Russia. And ironically, he has potentially put his regime in some threat over time, and has strengthened US alliances in the ways that US-led alliances in the way that that Professor Vole laid out so well, that NATO has never been stronger, the EU has never been stronger, the United States connection with those two organizations has never been stronger in the post-Cold War era. So that's the geopolitical takeaway. And then the other geopolitical takeaway that we didn't discuss here is that I think more and more nations are going to pursue nuclear weapons as a defense strategy, because the argument is that even though we can pump weapons into Ukraine and fight against Russian aggression quite effectively, actually, probably over a very long period of time, that the unwillingness of people to intervene against Russia because it's a nuclear power will send a signal to maybe South Korea, to Japan over time, that nuclear weapons are a way to go if you really want to prevent being directly attacked by a great power. And finally, I just wanted to say something that, again, I agree with Professor Nazarbayeva. We talked about global impacts. I'm wearing my blue and yellow. Ukraine is not an actor we talk too much about. And it's really Ukraine that's suffering so terribly. And from an analytic point of view, rather than just an emotional one, Ukraine has agency. And the reason I think this war is going to last a very long time is that, for reasons that Professor Nazarbayeva knows much better than I do, Putin cannot afford to lose. He has to be able to declare victory in some fashion. It's hard to imagine what fashion he can declare victory under which the Ukrainians stop fighting. In other words, what's the win set in that negotiating world? I don't really see it, and that's why I expect the war to last a very long time. And I expect the NATO allies to continue to pump weapons to the Ukrainians. And then I will get into the emotional side, which is, this is a terrible burden for Ukraine to have to carry for the rest of the world, but it's a burden that I believe they will carry. And we should be very sympathetic to the suffering that's going on in Ukraine during this process. It's unfortunate that they're on the front line of a struggle that really is at its base root, a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy.
Thank you so much, Professor Christensen. I'll just make a couple of quick comments as we're out of time. So for myself, I've been studying transformational warfare and strategic studies for the best part of my career. And this war, unfortunately, is once again a reminder that hard power still has to be researched in international relations, and thinking about strategy, as Tom mentioned as well, deterrence. These are all questions that continue to dominate international security and also international politics as well, unfortunately. So the more the war unfolds, unfortunately, it provides more evidence for us to study as well. So with that, let me wrap up today's wonderful discussion with our distinguished panelists. And I want to also bring your attention to a feedback form that I believe will be sent to all our participants. So we would be most grateful for any comments or feedback or suggestions for us as we take forward this series on thinking public policy. So please thank me in virtually, showing our appreciation to our panelists, and a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye.